One of my graduates from Bible college with me, so we both suffered together, so in Tyson's classes, I might add. Yeah, it's funny, Tyson takes a little stab at the youth there for the $5 gift. I mean, you guys just need to get jobs, so that's problem one right there. But just kind of looking around the room this morning, we've got a bunch of different jobs that and I just need a little bit of crowd participation. What are some of your job titles? Could I get somebody to just give me a couple? Just turn down the gain, Blake. There we go. Job titles. Somebody yell some at me. Electrician. Okay, we got electrician. Software developer, right? I need one more. Sorry, Ted? Control specialist, right? So we have a vast array of job titles that kind of come across the board, but I have to ask some of you that have maybe different job titles. Have you ever upgraded your job title? I used to drive a lot of truck back in the day, and so I used to live on Sonic radio, listen to Garner Andrews, and every once in a blue moon he'd have this segment on the radio called Upgraded Job Titles. So before I came to Jesus and I was looking for love in my life, I would go as many young adults did at 28, 21 years old. You'd go down to White Ave and you'd hit up the establishments, as Tyson would call them, and you'd try to impress a person there, right? You'd want to find love in those places. But at that time, I was driving a truck for doing drywall, and being a drywaller wasn't exactly a cliche great job. So I got this idea when I was listening to the radio the one day that you could upgrade your job title, and this had been a foreign thing to me. So you hear all these different things. Some of the examples I heard was a connoisseur of the custodial arts. Guy was a janitor, right? A merchandise acquisition specialist. They were a retail worker. So my brain got going, and I was like, I am now a sheetrock relocation engineer, and that's how I was going to sell myself. Yes, that's exactly some of the reactions I got when I used to tell people that was my job. They would just laugh at me. But it's funny how the social hierarchy of jobs, right, they kind of came up and down from just basically when you're a kindergartner, we're like almost indoctrinated, like, what are like the three main jobs? There's a Charles Barkley quote, the old basketball player said, there's only really four jobs. There's farmer, doctor, am I having to use a microphone? I'm getting waves at me. Oh, we're good? Okay. So, farmer, doctor, lawyer, there's these main job positions, but we're told at a young age, kids want to be an astronaut. I used to jokingly say I wanted to transform and become a fire truck one day, just trying to get a laugh out of people. But we've always kind of ranked how jobs took place. And I don't know if you've ever done that to yourself, where you've decided, hey, I've got a mortgage I got to pay or anything like that, and you have to put your job title down on those mortgage papers if you want to apply for a house. So Kate and I were selling our home last year, and we found out there was an offer that came through, and I never knew this was a thing, but apparently an artisan barista is somebody that put an offer in our house, and this guy made more than enough money to qualify for the home in tips. Right? He didn't make a good hourly wage, but the bank wouldn't approve him for the mortgage just based on his tips. They're like, that's not sustainable income. But it's funny when I talk about my dad, he would say, hey, there's only three ways, when you look at a job, it doesn't matter what the title is, just as long as there's a pension, job security, and you can provide for your family. Coming from an immigrant family, that was just kind of how we rolled. It was it didn't matter what you did. You could be sweeping floors, but as long as you had those three things, and if I told my dad that an artisan barista could have purchased our house, he would have laughed out loud. He's like, that's not a real job. But it's funny, Tyson kind of spoke a little bit last week about how it's even since the dawn of time, we've kind of ranked jobs, right? Not that anybody's job is beneath anybody else, and they're all important, but society kind of dictates that we have almost this inner ranking in our head. So this group of guys that I want to talk about this morning is the shepherds that engaged in Bethlehem. They were kind of sought as the lowest of the low in the job kind of hierarchy. They smelled bad, they were claimed to be uneducated, but they really actually had a super important job. How many of you guys like beef, right? Or meat in their lives, right? And they were shepherds to the flock that provided meat, clothing. Well, it was a super important job, but yet when they would go to the water, to the well, they'd say, oh, they smelled bad or anything. It's a good thing arranged marriages back then were a thing, or I don't think these guys would have survived. Right? Kate's like, it's a good thing you went to Bible college or you wouldn't have survived. And I was like, yeah, that's true. I wouldn't have won with that sheetrock relocation engineer thing. So where I kind of want to camp this morning is kind of want to look at this verse, and I'm just going to try and get technology to cooperate with me this morning. Blake, do you mind putting that slide up there, buddy? So the passage where we're kind of looking at this morning is actually like when the shepherds were called out. And this is Luke, if you want to follow along at all, if your Bibles, electronic Bibles, whatever you have with you, is Luke chapter 2, and it's 8 to 15. And it says, "And there were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night. An angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them. And they were terrified. But the angel said to them, 'Do not be afraid. I bring you good news that will cause great joy for the people. Today in the town of David, a Savior has been born to you. He is the Messiah, the Lord. This will be a sign to you that you will find a baby wrapped in clothes, laying in a manger.' Suddenly a great company of heavenly hosts appeared with the angel, praising God and saying, 'Glory to the God in the highest in the heavens, and earth, peace to those whom his favor rests.' When the angels had left them and had gone into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, 'Let's go to Bethlehem and see this thing that has happened, which is the Lord has told us about.'" So we just learned like a couple things there. First of all, the shepherds, they're already on the kind of social outcast kind of thing. And then now they've been told by this host of angels that they need to go and see this miraculous thing that happened. Well, first of all, if you see like these shepherds, the angel immediately says, "You know what, don't be scared, don't be afraid." I don't know how many of times if you've ever had somebody sneak up on you or jump around a corner and you get stunned a little bit. Now just imagine you're just doing your day-to-day job and something goes colossally wrong, right? Like a pipe bursts in your office, right? Or like you had something blow up on you as an electrician, you've electrocuted yourself, your apprentice electrocuted himself. You know, there's multitudes of things that can go wrong, but then out of nowhere you have to drop everything and leave. I'm sure we've all experienced that being parents here and having to move along and just leave the flock and go. But imagine if God said to you, "Hey, you have to leave, drop everything that you're doing and go and see this thing." It's not an easy feat. So these shepherds, they're not only chosen to go to this thing, but they actually have to move all their herd with them and their sheep with them and go and do this. But I don't know what was going through their minds at the time when they're like, they believed God, they had everything come before them, and then they're like, now why us? Have you ever been in that situation where you say, okay, but why me in this specific situation, God? See, these shepherds were literally the first witnesses of Jesus' birth, apart from the barn animals that were with them, right? And the innkeeper. The thing is, they were the first to witness, and it just shows that God did not care about riches and wealth in that situation. He could have easily chosen a king. There could have been so many other circumstances that could have put Jesus on a high, elevated state. But we learn from these shepherds that it's like we all come from humble beginnings to start with. See, when we look way back in biblical times, shepherds have just been the key backbone of the Israelites. There's always been shepherds involved. We spoke about Job a few months back. Tyson shared about being angry with God. Just to put it in perspective, Job had 14,000 sheep he was in charge of. Right? That was like a sign of royalty for them as well. He had all of this farmland and these farms. Right? The shepherds may have been the lowest on the totem pole, but the key part of it is that we're always along this linear line of sheep and shepherds. It's interesting to see, though, how these shepherds, they came with their sheep and they were the first witnesses, and I just can't imagine what's going through their head is that they're paused and they're saying, wow, this is just amazing. God selected me, but why? Have you ever been in that situation? But me, but why? It's no secret that when I started out in Bible college and everything, I wasn't a person that thought that I would be coming up and preaching or even doing youth things or just any of those things. I've had that moment of, but why me in these situations a lot of times. But I never realized the opportunities I could have seized in the mundane, right? Even doing the drywall, even working the nothing jobs. I did a stint where I was working for Home Depot. If you've ever worked retail, I have so much empathy for you. It's a tough gig. It's a tough slug. You're doing very demanding things for people, and you're trying to meet their needs where it's at, but it feels like you're just being talked down to constantly, and you're tough slugging it. I get that. But I was so stuck in the job, the task, that it's almost like you're looking at your feet constantly. I don't think these shepherds were staring at their feet when they realized that, God had chosen them for something so significant in their life. The greatest gift that ever came to this earth was Jesus. And they didn't have to stare down at their feet about it. They just said, let's go. So here's the situation for you, right? You've been offered all the money in the world, and you said, all right, you can either stay here and be comfortable in your job, or God's going to provide for you, but you have to pack everything you have and leave. Go, like 1,500 miles away. Would you do it? If it meant that you had such an opportunity to do God's work, but yet you had to wait those couple years. See, we saw the suffering with Job. We saw the suffering through the shepherds that they had to walk through it. Because secondly, what we learn about the shepherds is that it's always the youngest of the family that ended up on the low end of the totem pole. We saw that example with King David. See, King David cared for the flocks while his brothers went off to war. It's funny to see that when King David went off to be the king of a nation while his brothers were off to war. Do you ever think, like, seeing the lowest of low? Just out of curiosity, how many of us have younger siblings at home? Just a share of hands here. Like, they're like the either oldest, or isn't it the worst when it feels like the youngest child gets whatever they want? Right? You're just like, I feel like I'm being parented differently, or like, I just feel like they got off on a better foot. Saying that as the youngest person in my family, I was like, I don't think that's the case, We were equal, I swear to you. I probably got away with so many things as I was younger. But still, you see the youngest of the family, the shepherd, if you will, David, being called to such a high appointment. God has a history of choosing the unlikely. And it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to drop everything and start getting on your soapbox and start preaching. Maybe that is a calling on your heart, I don't know. But what we learn from these shepherds is that they may have been told that they're uneducated and everything, but they were the only tenants to those sheep at the time. See, sheep can get sunburned, they run into scraggy brush, they have to go fish them out. We hear stories of David often fighting off lions and bears for a sheep. I find it funny that we get compared to sheep in the Bible so often, because sheep are like probably one of the dumbest creatures ever. Growing up in like rural Ontario, I did get to experience a lot of dumb farm animals. Earliest childhood memory was one of my best friends, Mark, and I. We would take chickens, and you can put chickens to sleep actually. You can tuck their head underneath their shoulder, rock them, and then throw them off the top of the barn, and they wake up halfway through. Now, just a side note, right? Sheep were equally as dumb, because we'd look up and you'd see a sheep on top of the hayloft, and you're like, how did you get there? Right? Farm animals, they needed to be herded, cared for, right? They got cuts, scrapes, sunburns. You had to be a vet sometimes to them. You had to tend to them. You had to care for them. You had to watch them, because there might be dumb teenagers throwing chickens off the roof, right? And that's how I feel like God looks at us as sheep sometimes. He's got to herd us. They refer to Jesus as the great shepherd all the time. But finally, when we think about this job description, these shepherds, it was also out of circumstance. See, when the Roman Empire came and took over, and basically the Israelites were forced to do whatever they could to make money. So when the Roman Empire finally moved in, basically a lot of the Israelites turned to livestock, because it was the only way they could make money. It's the only way they could even survive. I'm sure none of us have been in those situations, right, where it's just like, nothing's went to plan, and you just have to do what you can just to get by. We've been through lots of recessions here in Alberta. We've been through even the past couple of years. It's just been hard pressing through, and I know a lot of us haven't had everything go to plan. It's been frustrating. But I always find myself looking at my feet, being like, okay, God, where are you taking me, where you're going? And I'm not looking up. I'm not seeing that those angels kind of pointing down at me saying, hey, you know what? You're about to witness something amazing. We lived in our neighborhood in Otwell for probably about like three or 4 years easily, and I probably knew one neighbor there across the street. He was my age. He's the only guy I really talked to. His name was Andrew. It was really cool. We got to have some cool experiences with him, but I think my biggest regret with that neighborhood and that experience is that I never got to get to know my neighbors. So when Kate and I moved into this neighborhood, it was like our personal goal. It's like, all right, we want to get to at least interact and know my neighbors. And it was funny enough that even through this past hunting season and everything like that, I was like, all right, God, can you give me an edge to working with my neighbors? And my next door neighbor, Phil, he's an Irish guy. I can hardly understand a word that he's saying. Honestly, fresh off the boat Irish. But I know that he loves smoking meat and all this stuff, and it's just a way that we can connect well with them. And I've been a bit cowardly, I'm not going to lie to you. I don't step up and talk to him much. But throughout the summer, Kate and I we were sitting at home, and the ice cream trucks started coming through the neighborhood, and you hear this weird ice cream bell. How many of us have young kids that would dart out the door regardless of payment, right? They would just boot. Right? So I encouraged my wife to run out the door like an aimless child, because she'd been bugging me for ice cream the whole week, and we were very tired with our kid at home. And so she boots it out there, and funny enough, who's standing there? Phil. our neighbor, that I could hardly understand a word. And what did he decide? He decided that he was going to buy ice cream for anybody who came outside that day. Talk about an opportunity that God's kind of slapping me in the face with, being like, you know what, you could have been out there chatting with Phil, could have been interacting with your neighbors there. I find I always am staring at my feet, wondering where God's taking me, instead of looking up and realizing that we are the shepherds being called to go. You see, it's a weird stigma that God calls us to the discomfort. I'm sure I'm not the only one in the room who's had those plans worked out. But God's also called the unlikely. See, these shepherds, they worked tireless hours, tireless days, and had no thank for them, right? They just did their jobs day in and day out. It's because they had to, not because they got to. We need to have that attitude change in our lives, that we get to. See, if we go back through this verse and we realize that a chorus of angels was calling them out, saying, you know what, let's do this. Let's go to Bethlehem and do this thing and see that what has happened, which is what the Lord has told us about. How many times have we not been listening for that call? See, God calls the unlikely and the mundane. God calls the unlikely, and he also calls the unqualified. I'm sure I can comfortably say that comparatively to my first sermon that I preached here, this is infinitely better than my last sermon that I've preached here. Tyson tells me often, saying, like, he can remember even my nervousness walking into class on my first day of Bible college. I can even compare to some of my college students now who we get to interact with on a daily basis, that I've never felt qualified for any of this. But God calls the unqualified. He has a history of calling fishermen out to be disciples. He has a history of calling shepherds to come witness the greatest gift that he ever gave this earth. God has this audacity to call us out in even the most unlikely circumstances to look up. I know this has been not only a struggle for some of us, even going into this Christmas season, reminded of a lot of lost hurts, a lot of hurts going into the season. It could be financial struggles. It could be any of those things that we're struggling, even with our own job. We were rethinking our career. But maybe this is God also calling you to even do what I should have done, and going out to my neighbor and saying, hey, you know what? Phil, I'd love to invite you out to Christmas. Heck, I'll even tell him to watch the sermon and be like, Phil, I spoke about you today. You want to give it a listen? It'll be the bravest thing I do for the guy, but still. I encourage you this morning that this is just a challenge onto you, that there's somebody in your life, whether it's a friend, coworker, or somebody that you play sports with, or even somebody that you interact with on a daily basis. We've had so many stories come out of our church where it's even guys getting coffee in the drive-thru and they witness somebody that's hurting, and you know what? God's calling us to step up a little bit more. God called shepherds the lowest of the low. Like literally people wouldn't even look at them at the well, and he said, hey, I got something so special for you to see. Don't be like me. Don't be looking at your feet. Don't be saying, okay, God, where am I going next? What am I doing? Because God's calling us to the glory in the God, because that line that says here in the verse, to the glory to the God in the highest heaven on earth. Peace to those whom his favor rests. Because when the angels had left and had gone into heaven, the shepherd said, let's go to Bethlehem and see this thing that has happened to you, which the Lord has told us about. God's calling us constantly. But are we listening? So I encourage you this morning, I just say, take that moment with each other, because we're going to take a little bit of a prayer time right now, and I just want to ask if you could just turn to somebody in your pew and just say this, hey, what is that one person that you could invite to Christmas Eve? Or what is that one person that you could pray for this week? Or what is that one thing? Or maybe you're that person that right now that needs that prayer as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to put on a bit of music there. Blake's going to play it for us. And I just want you to take this moment to pray with each other. And if you have that calling saying, hey, you know what, I just could really use some prayer, throw your hand up. Let's pray for you this morning. And I really want us to just lean into this calling, just like the shepherds have been. Don't be looking at your feet, but let's look to each other and see how we're going. So introverts, I just ask you to, or extroverts, I just ask you to kind of like lead the talk this morning and to say, hey, who's somebody we can pray for this morning, and just pray for that name. Okay, let's go ahead.